Can we?
Yeah, it's fine. You can start.
All right, here we go. Hello, my name is Burdett, and for my senior capstone project, I chose to talk about chronic traumatic encephalopathy in football players. So a little bit of backstory on why I chose to talk about this. In 2015, I watched the movie Concussion starring Will Smith, and that was really the first time I saw the relationship between getting hit in the head and what happens after that. So as Addie mentioned, I've played hockey since I was 5. It's a 13-year career, and in my career, I've accumulated just over 10 concussions, and 4 of which have had me out for multiple months and extended periods of time. And before watching this movie, it was kind of like, well, I got a concussion, I know that's bad, but I'll be back. And that's it. I watched the movie and I saw, well, I might have brain damage. Well, like, that's not the most forefront thing in my mind, but that it resonates with me, this topic. And although I don't play football, I do play a contact sport where head contact is relevant. And so that really piqued my interest. And when I had the opportunity to research any topic of my choosing, I couldn't pass this up. So what exactly is chronic traumatic encephalopathy? So it's better known as CTE. You've probably heard about it. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a neurodegenerative disease that is caused by repeated hits to the head over a prolonged period of time. So what does neurodegenerative mean? That means your brain is slowly deteriorating. It's not like you get hit in the head and you die. It's you get hit in the head and your brain starts to slowly kill off brain cells. And that's why you see football players die at 50. You see football players die at 40, and then they die of heart attacks and they die of other things. But when you look and they look into their brains, they see all of these things. But that's 10, 15 years after they retire. And that's because the process is slow and their brain is slowly deteriorating. It's not one big bang, but it's a process that happens over time. And CTE is found primarily in football players. That's where you hear about it the most, but it's also found in military personnel, boxers. Boxers is a big one. Hockey players, lacrosse players, soccer players even. Just that repeated hit to the head in anything. Construction workers too. So a couple of key things to understand before you dive into the science of what CTE is doing to the brain is just what's going on in your brain, right? So our brain has a bunch of different parts. You've probably heard about, your cortex, these different parts. And what's going on, one thing that's consistent with all the parts of your brain is that they all have neurons. Our brains are composed of around 90 billion neurons, and neurons are the primary transmitter of information from one part of your brain to the other part of the brain, and from your brain to the rest of your body. You want to move your leg, those neurons are telling your leg to move. And so when you're looking at CT and you're looking at the brain, you really want to zoom in on the neuron. You want to zoom in on a specific part of the neuron, which is the axon. So neurons have 4 big parts. They have the cell body, the axon terminal, and the dendrite. And when you're looking at CTE, you really want to look at the axon. So what is the axon? The axon is this super long, stringy, very skinny and fragile kind of transportation system that connects the cell body to the rest of the neuron, and it's also what helps transmit those electrical currents from one part of your brain to the other. But the axon doesn't do that all alone. Inside of this super skinny, and think about a strand of hair. If you took one strand of your hair, you'd think, wow, that's skinny. Well, take that and it's 100 times smaller than that. Don't multiply. It's 100 times smaller than a strand of hair. Okay, and so, but the axon's not transmitting that information alone. Inside of the axon are something what we call microtubules. And microtubules are even smaller and even thinner transportation methods for those electric currents and signals that are inside of the axon. So the way I like to think about it is kind of like a subway system. In the subway system, you have your underground tunnel and you have the train. And I think of the tunnel as the axon and the train as the microtubules, because the train is really what's taking the people from point A to point B, and the tunnel is kind of what provides it a little bit of protection. So the axon is giving that tube, that tunnel for the microtubules. And now I just told you that the axon is like 100 times smaller than a strand of hair. The microtubules, there's a bunch of them inside of the axon, and that means they have to be even smaller. So think about it like a wire. If you were to take a wire and put one strand of hair inside of that wire, now wire is already pretty small, but you could fit a lot of strands of hair. And that's kind of what we're looking at. Think of the strand of hair as your microtubule and the wire as your axon, right? And so the microtubules have to be so small and so skinny and tiny to fit inside of the axon that they're extremely fragile. I mean, they can break on any type of impact. And so the brain kind of accommodates for this fragility and this lack of structure that they have by putting a protein around those microtubules. So inside of the axon, you'll see your microtubules, and then you'll see this protein called tau that builds around, probably go to the next slide, this protein called tau that builds around that microtubule. And it serves as kind of an exoskeleton. It gives it structure and makes sure it doesn't collapse on itself. So that's kind of what's happening in a healthy neuron, right? You have 90 billion of those. Let's talk about what goes wrong. So why is CTE happening? Well, when you get hit in the head, and this could be, let's talk about concussions first. When you get hit in the head and you get diagnosed with a concussion, you have a headache, what's happening there is the axon itself is breaking. The axon, not the microtubules. Well, the microtubules are also breaking, but everything's breaking. That transportation system, your tunnel, is collapsing and those brain cells are dying, right? That's a concussion. We all know that concussions are bad. But what happens when you just get hit in the head and nothing, you don't have a concussion, you don't have a headache, nothing's really happening, you don't feel anything? Well, that's still having an effect on your brain, and that is probably the biggest reason for CTE. You know, I've had 10 concussions, but it's probably not the 10 concussions that are gonna, give me CTE when they observe my brain when I'm 60. It's gonna be all of those little hits that didn't matter, because when those little hits happen, your axon is staying intact, your axon is fine, right? But the microtubules inside, they're not built to sustain that type of impact, even just a small collision that doesn't affect the rest of your head, like that doesn't make you feel that impact. And so that tau protein that's there to help it maintain structure, it's not there to protect it from getting hit. We weren't built to get hit in the head often. That's not why, our brains are not meant to be hit in the head like that. And so when those microtubules, when you get hit in the head, those microtubules, they don't know what to do, and that tau protein is not built to sustain that. So what happens is that tau starts to peel off of the outside of the microtubule. And that tau protein, which is meant for good and meant to keep structure, well, when it's kind of free floating, once it dislodges from the microtubule, it starts to interact with the other tau protein, connecting with them and pulling those off of the microtubules as well. And when that tau protein is not on the microtubule and connected to the microtubule, that's when you start to see problems, because the microtubules start to collapse on themselves, and then the axons start to collapse on themselves, and then your brain cells start to die. And that is what kind of the science of CTE is. And that happens over a long period of time. That's why it's neurodegenerative, because the tau takes a long time to come off and peel and get tangled with other tau. But essentially, that's what's happening when you look at CTE. When you look at those brain scans, you're seeing big buildups of tau where you shouldn't be seeing big buildups of tau. And so one scary thing about CTE is it's undiagnosable in life. You can't do a CT scan, you can't do an MRI, you can't look at the brain through a screen of a living person and say, hey, this person has CTE. It's only diagnosable after death. And the reason for that is because these tau proteins are inside very small slivers of your brain, right? I told you how small these parts are. And so the only way to observe CTE is to cut the brain into slices and see it under a microscope. So right now, you could be conscious that maybe you have CTE, but you cannot be sure. And that's a very scary aspect of it. Sorry, I talked over, missed the slide. Okay, so I'll go over a very brief history of how CTE came to be. So in 1928, Dr. Harrison Martin looked at boxers and he said, hey, these guys look like they're kind of woozy in the ring. But they don't just look like they're woozy in the ring, they look like they're woozy after the ring. And then they get fined, and then 20 years later, they start to put their fingers in the toaster and they start to tase themselves. Like, what's going on there, right? And so, I have what?
You're at 9 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I got 1 minute to talk to you about CTE in the NFL. I had to skip over some stuff, but CTE in the NFL. So what's going on with CTE in the NFL? Mike Webster was the first NFL player to die and have CTE found in his brain, and that was in 2002. Immediately after Mike Webster died, the NFL came out with a statement saying, well, brain injuries are a rarity in the NFL. That doesn't happen. This is a once-in-a-lifetime situation. 2004, another player dies, found a CTE in his brain. And then the NFL, they create this committee, the MTBI, Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, and they say, okay, well, now we're going to start investigating this stuff. The person they put at the head of this committee was not even a neurologist, not somebody who specialized in the brain. And so more things started to happen. More players started to come out with symptoms and started to complain about these things. And the NFL, instead of addressing it, they denied. And they say that they put in these protocols to protect their players. But in 2007, there was 3 cases of players being knocked out cold on the field and being sent back into the game. And when Roger Goodell, the new commissioner of the NFL, became the commissioner, he commended the MTBI on their amazing work with player safety just a few months after 3 knocked out cold players were sent back into the game. So I don't have a lot of time left, but essentially the purpose of this was to kind of talk about how, give you the science behind CTE, and then give you kind of an insight on how just lacking the NFL is on protecting its players and how the safety of its players is not at the forefront. And one thing I will say before my time is up is that a study in 2017 was conducted where 111 deceased former NFL players' brains were looked at. 110 of those brains exhibited symptoms of CTE, and every single one of those players died before they were 70. So that's my time. Thank you.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes for questions from Mason and Remy if you want to start getting in.
So you mentioned in 1928, the doctor,
Harrison Martin.
yeah, that guy talking about brain darkness or whatever. So was the first case with CTE first thing in 2002?
So not CTE, it's called punch drunk syndrome, and there's a differentiation between those two things. So boxers were looked at, and their brains were first looked at in 1974. There was no actual brain studies done until far later.
Yeah.
But Martland kind of proposed the idea. But the difference between what was happening with the boxers and the football players was when they opened their brains up, there was a lot of swelling and bruising that happened even 20 years after they were done.
Yeah.
With the football players, there's not. It looks like a normal brain.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what type of scanning they had at that time, but if you were to scan that brain, you would be able to see the enlarged bruised sections, whereas in the NFL players, it looks like a healthy brain until you slice into it.
Yeah.
So are there any noticeable symptoms to CTE that can be noticed before?
Well, so the symptoms of CTE are extremely broad, and they are very similar to dementia, right? So when I talked to you about Mike Webster, he died in 2002. He started exhibiting symptoms in 1990, and he would, I talked to you about tasing yourself to sleep. He physically could not go to sleep, and so he bought a taser to tase himself to sleep, and he started losing his memory. He would sleep outside in his car, outside of his house, and he would cite that, oh, well, I was lost and I didn't know how to get home. So fogginess of memory, lack of consciousness, inability to feel emotions, stuff like that. Those are signs of CTE, but they're also signs of other neurodegenerative diseases. So it's really tough, and there's no biomarkers for CTE, so you can't really differentiate that. So,
I'm assuming there's a set of massive class action lawsuits out there right now against the NFL.
Right, so in 2013, the NFL actually settled a $765 million lawsuit with a large group of retired players, but they admit no wrongdoing. They admit no problems with safety. They don't admit to their league causing brain injury. Interestingly enough, they settled for close to $1 billion. So there are lawsuits, and the people who are filing them are winning, but the NFL still claims no responsibility.
You pay them all.
Was there anything difficult to try and find information on in your research, regarding the NFL or things like the lawsuits and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of hidden stuff, especially with the NFL. They do a great job at burying what's going on with their league. There is one page that I found that kind of gave me a timeline of all the wrongdoings of the NFL, but that was on the 7th page of Google, right? So in terms of researching CTE itself, there's a lot of research on that, and I was able to accumulate a good kind of database. But in looking at the wrongdoings of the NFL, they're very good at hiding that and pushing that to the bottom of the list. Yeah.
I got the whole when athletes are getting hit in the head. How do helmets affect how much injury or
So
like,
helmets are important, right? They do help you a little bit, but when your brain is engulfed in this kind of like gelatin inside of your skull, and when you get hit in the head, the helmet it's helping a little bit, but your brain, regardless of how much helmet there is, it's still moving around. And when your brain moves around and smashes against your skull, the helmet can't protect you from all of that. Those axons and those microtubules are still getting affected. Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Time for